Boa tarde, quem está aqui já acompanhando o canal, nossa conversa hoje sobre neoplatonismo e o prazer de receber aqui dois colegas, na verdade, digamos que são colegas porque são estudiosos do pensamento neoplatônico, o professor Dominic O'Meara, que todos já conhecem de seus estudos, e o professor Marcos Reis, da Universidade Federal de Niterói, né? Que também já participa aqui das nossas pesquisas e conversas há bastante tempo, né? Só um pouco de formação, né? O professor Dominic, ele é professor emérito da Universidade de Freiburg, né, na Suíça, e nos deu a honra de estar aqui hoje expondo um pouco a temática que ele mesmo escolheu, né, e que Marcos vai conduzir, fazendo essa mediação. As perguntas podem ser feitas em francês ou em inglês, e, ao final, a gente segue aquela dinâmica de transmitir ao professor as questões. Sem mais, eu vou passar, então, a palavra ao professor Marcos, para que possa dar início a essa nova conversa aqui no canal.
So it's a great pleasure and a great honor to have Professor Dominic O'Meara with us. As Cicero has already said, presented both of us. Professor O'Meara is from University of Freiburg in Switzerland, correct? And it's a great pleasure. And today we're going to have it's a very interesting topic and a very important topic in the studies of Neoplatonism is, as I can understand, is how to read Plato. That is a very, very important question and something very profound about Plato, especially because he doesn't have a type of writing that is exactly as all the other writings in philosophy. He writes in dialogues. So how understand Plato? How catch its real meaning? Correct. So, Professor, the title that you presented us is "What is a good interpreter of Plato, according to the ancient Neoplatonist commentators." So, as I said, it's a great honor. We are very anxious to see what you have to present for us, and I want you to feel very, very welcome and very free to speak as you want. And you can start. You feel at
Thank you
ease.
very much. Thank you very much. I have a little preliminary question. How long would you like me to talk?
Yeah. What about you go on like for 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and
Okay.
after 30 minutes is okay if you want
Yeah.
more or less. But what I was thinking about around 30 minutes, half an hour, and we
Okay.
can open to questions and I can
Okay.
ask you what I'm thinking about it. Okay?
Okay.
That's okay with you?
Okay.
Great.
Very good. And then another little question before I start. I sent a kind of a handout with passages,
Perfect.
which I quote. Do you think these can be made available to the people watching?
Yes,
Or
yes. As Cicero, Professor
very good.
Cicero can pass it right. You wanted to be online right now, or you want to talk a little bit and afterwards?
Well, maybe when I quote them,
Perfect. When you
it might
quote
be
them, I
easier to
will
the
I will
text
ask.
as I quote them. Just
Perfect.
before.
Perfect.
Okay.
When you
Okay.
quote them, I will
Very
ask
good.
for Cicero to project it.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. And then if I'm speaking too fast or not clearly enough, could you please tell me stop?
Okay.
Speak
Okay. I
more
will.
clearly.
I will.
Okay.
Mm-hmm,
Thank you.
mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'll start. And so the question, yes, is what do we consider to be a good or a bad interpretation of Plato? We can ask this question. We can ask, what criteria will we, in order to judge if an interpretation of Plato is good or bad? Who decides what these criteria would be? Who applies them? Today, for example, we might say that philological competence, the ability to read ancient Greek, is one, if not the only criterion. Other criteria might be adequate historical and literary competence. Further criteria might be, for example, publication in a journal practice review, my God, belonging to the right university, writing in English, number of hits on internet, and so on. In this paper, I propose looking at the ancient views on what it takes to be a good interpreter of Plato. Since these ancient views may be of interest in bringing into sharper focus, by way of contrast, the assumptions and procedures which we follow today in reading Plato. So far, so good?
Perfect. So far, so good. It's very loud and clear. It's okay.
Thank you. So, among the ancient people I want, among the ancient people I want to talk about on this subject is Plotinus, who taught Platonic philosophy, of course, in Rome in the 3rd century. And then I want to talk about some teachers of Platonic philosophy in Athens and Alexandria in the 5th and 6th centuries, Marinus, Simplicius, Olympiodorus, and David. I will present what these ancient readers of Plato thought was required of the good interpreter of Plato, in particular the moral and intellectual qualities which should characterize such an interpreter. You will have noticed that I have moved from speaking of good or bad interpretations of Plato to speaking of good or bad interpreters. The reason is essentially that the interpretation of Plato often took place in late antiquity in well-defined small communities, usually a school made up of teachers and students, individuals with particular needs and characters. We are not dealing here with the modern fiction, the fiction of a so-called scientific community, supposedly made up of disembodied, depersonalized brains, all contributing to knowledge on an equal basis. Rather, we're dealing with individuals who were usually involved in very concrete human situations, those of teaching, where the qualities of the teacher who interprets Plato and the qualities of the students who read Plato were of great importance. But first, I think we have to ask preliminary questions. Why should we read Plato? And in particular, his works rather than those of another philosopher? And why do his works require interpretation? I will begin with these preliminary but fundamental questions with respect to Plotinus, and then I'll talk about what he thinks is the difference between a good and a bad reader of Plato. And after that, I moved to these teachers of Platonic philosophy in Athens and in Alexandria in the 5th and 6th centuries. To put it very simply, Plotinus understands the human condition as follows. We are rational souls whose nature, origin, and home is to be found in an immaterial, purely intelligible realm where we have access to full knowledge and to a vision of an ineffable absolute first principle of all reality, the One, which is also the good to which we aspire. But as souls, we become involved in the material world. Our mission is to order and beautify it in the light of the knowledge which we possess. For us, as individual souls, this concerns in particular our relation to our individual bodies and the matters involved in bodily life. We become distracted, however, indeed infatuated with material preoccupations, and, in the process, turn away from our knowledge of ourselves, or self-knowledge, and our knowledge of our origin, the knowledge we naturally possess as souls. Driven by the illusions of material desires, we become confused, ignorant, and fail in our deep desire to reach the good. In order to save ourselves from this condition, we must, as souls, recover knowledge of ourselves, of intelligible reality, and return to our original existence. The knowledge which we need to recover can be found, Plotinus believes, in Plato's works. By reading him, we can discover our lost knowledge of ourselves, where we come from. Plato possesses this knowledge, as do other selected privileged people, such as Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and Parmenides. But Plato's texts are the fullest source of the knowledge which we need, since the other philosophers are sometimes somewhat enigmatic and incomplete. Thus, it is by reading Plato's works that we can best come back to our transcendent existence in the intelligible realm. By reading Plato, we find a way to return to full knowledge and to the vision of the absolute good. However, one should note that reading Plato for Plotinus is not a matter of simply taking knowledge from Plato, as if simply transferring information. The knowledge to be found in Plato is already present in our souls. In reading Plato, we can rediscover what we already know. Referring to Heraclitus's enigmatic way of speaking, Plotinus supposes that Heraclitus thought that, I quote, we ought to seek by ourselves as he himself sought and found, end of quote. So also for Plotinus, in reading Plato, we must ourselves reach knowledge and an understanding of the issues. I wonder if I can have the first passage. Is that possible?
Yes, Cícero, você projeta para gente, Cícero, a primeira passagem? Yes, I'm asking him to put the first passage. Yeah, it's coming right now.
Oh, great. Wait, now that's number 2. Can you go back to 1? Yes.
Isso, na primeira, Cícero. Aí, ó.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'll read this passage. This is Plotinus. Our thought runs into difficulties. We consider the statements of the ancient philosophers about them who differ one from the other, and perhaps also different interpretations of the same statements, resting on these and thinking that it suffices if we're able, when we're asked, to state the opinions of the ancients, happy to be released from the need of further research about them. Now, we should consider that some of the blessed philosophers of ancient times have found out the truth, but it is proper to investigate which of them have attained it most completely, and how we, too, could reach an understanding of these things. So the end of the quotation. Now, if we return to reading Plato as a way of recovering a knowledge which is innate in our souls, we find that Plato says many things in many places, and sometimes not the same things. For example, on the question of why soul descends into body. Plato's works require interpretation. In reading him, we cannot simply reproduce what he says. We must philosophize for ourselves, finding in his works a coherent body of knowledge which we already have. But how is this to be done? In this connection, it will be useful to take up our question, what is the difference between a good and a bad interpretation of Plato? An opportunity for doing this is given by Plotinus's polemics with the Gnostics of his time. Plotinus thinks that the Gnostics are responsible for a misleading reading of Plato, and that Gnosticism is a corruption of Platonism. In attacking what he regards as the Gnostics' bad reading of Plato, Plotinus shows not only what he thinks is responsible for this bad reading of Plato, but also by way of contrast, what he thinks could yield a good interpretation of Plato. So I start first with what he denounces as a bad reading of Plato, and then moving to what he thinks makes a good reading. Plotinus criticizes the Gnostic way of reading Plato in the following passage. If I can have the second passage. Just down a little bit. Very good. Number 2, yes. For these doctrines are there in Plato, and when they, the Gnostics, state them clearly in this way, they do well. If they wish to disagree on these points, there is no unfair hostility in saying to them that they should not recommend their own opinions to their audience by ridiculing and insulting the Greeks, but that they should show the correctness of their own merits of all points of doctrine which are peculiar to them and differ from the view of the Greeks, stating their real opinions courteously, humanos, as befits philosophers, and fairly, on the points where they are opposed, looking to the truth and not hunting fame by censuring men who have been judged good from ancient times by men of worth, and saying that they themselves are better than the Greeks. End of quote. Thus, according to Plotinus, the Gnostics take their doctrines from Plato. He does not object to their disagreeing with Plato on some points. What he objects to is their attitude, which is that of arrogant and vainglorious men who seek fame for themselves by disparaging, insulting others. With this attitude, Plotinus contrasts what he regards as spirit which is well disposed, philosophical, and just, a disposition which does not exclude disagreeing with Plato, as long as this disagreement relates to a proper attitude. The contrast between the attitude of the Gnostics and that which Plotinus thinks our attitude should be to Plato is a contrast between opposed moral and intellectual qualities. As we can see in the following passage, taken from the same polemic of 3, if you can roll it up a little bit.
Terceiro, Cícero, pode botar pouquinho para cima.
Number 3. Yeah, okay. Observe throughout that the kind of philosophy which we pursue, besides all its other excellences, displays simplicity and straightforwardness of character, along with clear thinking, and aims at dignity, not rash arrogance, and combines its confident boldness with reason, and much safeguarding and caution, and a great deal of circumspection of comparison for the rest. But the system of the others, the Gnostics, is in every part constructed on entirely opposed principles. In this passage, we can distinguish on the one hand moral virtues, is a simplicity of character, courage, dignity, and on the other hand, intellectual virtues, clear thinking, caution, circumspection. These virtues should characterize correct philosophizing in Plotinus's view. It is in this spirit that we should read Plato. The Gnostics manifest the opposite in their approach, not only the vainglory and the arrogance that we have already met, but also we can assume the opposite to the intellectual virtues which Plotinus mentions. We see in this way that according to Plotinus, to philosophize correctly, which is also to read Plato in the correct way, we need to possess a good moral character, exercising courage, moderation, justice, as well as the virtues of reason, clarity of thinking, care, and circumspection, wisdom. The relation between being virtuous on these two levels, moral and intellectual, and philosophizing correctly, is all brought out by Plotinus in the last passage, which I would like to quote from his polemics with Gnosticism. So this is the number 4, the 4th passage. If you can roll it down a bit. Very good. Thank you very much. Great. Those who already have the gnosis should start going after it here and now, and in their pursuit should first of all set straight their conduct here below, as they come from a divine nature. For that nature is aware of nobility and despises the pleasure of the body. But those who have no share of virtue would not be moved at all towards that higher world. For it does no good at all to say, look to God, unless one also teaches how one is to look. And refraining from pleasure, or from having no control over my emotions, and from remembering the name God at the same time, being in the grip of all the passions and making no attempt to get rid of any of them. In reality, it is virtue which goes before us to the goal, and when it comes to exist in the soul along with wisdom, shows God. But God, if you talk about him without true virtue, is only a name. Thank you. So I go on. Virtue is thus required of us, both moral and intellectual. If we are to reach the God, we seek the absolute good. To succeed in this way, we must philosophize correctly, and this philosophizing can be done by reading Plato correctly. Thus I conclude that good readers of Plato, in Plotinus's eyes, are readers who have the moral and intellectual virtues which will allow them to recover intelligible knowledge while they read Plato. These readers will not simply repeat uncritically what Plato says. By reading Plato, thanks to their virtuous disposition, they can recover in themselves the innate knowledge of which they have lost sight, reaching a coherent understanding which also underlies the many, sometimes diverging things Plato says in his works. In reaching this knowledge, readers of Plato will escape the ignorance, confusion, and error characterizing the human condition, intellect, which is how Plotinus defines the highest happiness for humans. So I've finished with Plotinus moment anyway. How am I doing for time? I'm about halfway through.
It's perfect. It's okay. It's great.
Is this okay?
You're halfway through in minutes. Also, it's perfect.
Is that all right? Okay, so I'll go on.
Yes. Yeah.
You don't mean to stop. Okay.
Not at all.
Maybe it gets more interesting now. So I want to move on to late antiquity, to these teachers of Platonism in Athens and Alexandria in the 5th and 6th centuries. And I think we can say that they follow Plotinus in general as regards to the questions as to why we should read Plato and why Plato requires interpretation. It's the same thing. We are lost souls. We've lost the knowledge of who we are, what we are, where we come from, of the good that we want to find. And in this condition of ignorance and confusion, we can recover this lost self-knowledge by reading select philosophers such as Plato, but whose works require philosophical interpretation. There are some new elements, though, when we move into late antiquity to the 5th, 6th centuries after Plotinus. Plotinus, for example, sees certain philosophers such as Plato as having privileged access to knowledge. Later Platonists even thought that there were certain superior souls which retain their purity when they come down into the body. And these quasi-divine philosophers include not only Plato, but sources of knowledge, in particular divine revelations such as the Orphic poems or the Chaldean oracles. They also thought that the truth, the knowledge revealed by these sources of Plato, the Chaldean oracles, this knowledge was veiled, hiding from the uninitiated. And this idea was especially popular in Pythagoreanism, so you couldn't have direct access to knowledge. Another point I want to mention is that Aristotle received an important place here. It was thought that Aristotle had brought knowledge as regards the lower levels of human existence in logic, physics, and ethics. And so his works were integrated in the curriculum of a Platonic school. Scholastic structures developed in comparison with the rather informal group that Plotinus had in Rome. More formalized curriculum being Aristotle, followed by the main curriculum made up of reading Plato's dialogues. These trends in the schools in Athens and Alexandria meant that reading Plato became somewhat of a scholastic business. It became a matter of teachers and students. The teacher who gives knowledge and the student who receives it. The question of how to read Plato correctly becomes a question as to how to teach Plato correctly and how to study him correctly. This brings a certain danger of dogmatism and authoritarianism and a loss of intellectual autonomy in the student. However, whatever the realities of school life, the teacher could still present his students with an ideal, the ideal of a good reading of Plato. If we come to Proclus now, the head of the school in Athens, we find that his successor Marinus compiled, after Proclus' death in 485, a life of Proclus, in which Marinus tries to show that Proclus had achieved in his life completely successful philosophical life. Marinus does this by describing how Proclus had reached, in the successive stages of his life, various levels of virtue in a gradation going from the lowest to the highest perfection possible to humans. Plotinus distinguished, we saw, two levels of virtue, moral and intellectual virtue. Marinus, Proclus' pupil and successor, however, more elaborate hierarchy of the virtues, and tries to show how Proclus' lifespan exemplified each level of this hierarchy, from its beginnings up to its summit. So we find a description of Proclus' virtues when he was an ideal student, followed by an account of Proclus' virtues when he became in turn a supreme teacher. I begin with Proclus' student days, as recounted by Marinus, and with the virtues Marinus associates with this stage in Proclus' life. As a student, Proclus, according to Marinus, possessed the ethical and political virtues. Ethical virtues are moral dispositions of the soul, a moral character acquired through training and habituation prior to the acquisition of rational virtue. These dispositions concern the ordering of the irrational aspects of soul's life in the body, passions, desires, emotions. Proclus acquired these virtues when he was a student in Alexandria and later in Athens. The virtues that Marinus named are love of honor, philotimia, chastity, and a receptivity to what is morally fine, takala. As a student in Athens, Proclus also displayed higher virtues, the political virtues, which are moral dispositions led by rational virtue, in particular practical wisdom, phronesis. On this level of virtue, Marinus has Proclus studying Aristotle's political works and Plato's Laws and Republic. However, the emphasis is Marinus less on Proclus' studies than on his actions in the political arena. Moving on then to a yet higher level of virtue, purificatory virtue, Marinus presents Proclus as already doing some teaching. He teaches these purificatory virtues, but especially he provides his students with a model to imitate in his own acts and practices of purification. The emphasis on teaching becomes much stronger when we move to the chapters concerning the level of virtue superior to purificatory virtue, theoretical virtue, which is the excellence of pure reason achieved with the access to true knowledge. Here, Marinus fills out his description of Proclus as a teacher. The teaching is essentially the interpretation of texts, exegesis of Plato's dialogues, of course, but also of other sources of divine knowledge. Proclus was an extremely active teacher, manifesting a divine inspiration, a critical spirit, clarity, and industriousness. So I'd like to read the next passage, number 5. If we can get to, there we are, yes. He, Proclus, went through all the treatises of his predecessors, and if anything in them was fruitful, he made critical use of it. But if he found anything worthless, he rejected this entirely as an absurdity, and if anything was contrary to good principles, he refuted it polemically with severe examination. In his seminars also he dealt with each point ably and clearly, and wrote everything down in treatises. So immense was his love of labor, philoponia. End of quote. We see that a point I mentioned earlier in relation to Plotinus, that the exegete should not slavishly accept everything in the text, but should read it critically, was not forgotten by Proclus. What mattered was the true knowledge to be recovered in interpreting ancient texts. This true knowledge on the level of theoretical virtue is knowledge of transcendent divine realities, what we might call metaphysics or philosophical theology. In conclusion, we can say that Plotinus's view that the good interpreter of Plato should possess moral and intellectual virtue reappears in Marinus's biography of his teacher Proclus, but in a more elaborate form. The hierarchy of virtue goes beyond the two levels distinguished by Plotinus, becoming a gradation going from ethical and political virtues to purificatory and theoretical virtues and further. The interpretation of Plato is articulated in two stages, that of the student of Plato and that of the teacher. At the student stage in Proclus's life, ethical virtue is emphasized in the study of philosophy, whereas political virtue is prominent in Proclus's action. Teaching already begins for Proclus on the level of purificatory virtue, but emphasis continues to be placed on action, whereas teaching becomes a more prominent part of Proclus's life on the level of theoretical virtue. There Proclus shows his command of intelligible knowledge in the exegesis of Plato and of other ancient sources. Thus, the ideal interpreter of Plato must have, as a student, the ethical and political virtues, and then also, as a teacher, higher levels of virtue, purificatory, and especially theoretical or intellectual virtue. I'll come to the last part of my paper. It's not too long. I conclude with the last commentators on Plato of late antiquity, the last members of the schools of Athens, Alexandria. First, Simplicius, member of the school of Athens, 29, to leave, to go to exile in Persia, and then to returning back to the Byzantine emperor later, where he wrote his commentaries on Aristotle. In Athens, Proclus trained Ammonius, who went to Alexandria to lead a Platonist school there. Later members of the school being Olympiodorus and the commentators known as David or Elias. For Simplicius and these late Alexandrian commentators, we have mostly their commentaries on Aristotle, texts belonging to the preparatory curriculum, intended as a preliminary to the study of Plato. The Alexandrian commentators in particular tell us a lot about the school setting of their work, their curriculum and methods of teaching. Among other things, they tell us what the qualities of a good student and good teacher should be. The material is formalized and can also be found repeated with variations in the works of other members of the school. What they say about the qualities of the good student and good teacher concerns, in the first instance, the study and interpretation of Aristotle, but since Aristotle was seen as preparing the way for reading Plato, we can infer that the same qualities would also be required of the student and teacher in reading and interpreting Plato. I begin with Simplicius, what he tells us about the qualities of a good teacher. And the next passage is number 6. Passage number 6, please. Thank you. This is from Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's categories. Simplicius says that the worthy exegete of Aristotle's writings must not fall wholly short of the latter's greatness of intellect. He must also have experience of everything the philosopher has written and must know Aristotle's stylistic habits. His judgment must be impartial so that he may neither, out of misplaced zeal, seek to prove something well said to be unsatisfactory, nor, if some point should require attention, should he obstinately persist in trying to demonstrate that Aristotle is always and everywhere infallible, as if he had enrolled himself in the philosopher's school. The good exegete must, I believe, not convict the philosophers of discordance by looking only at the letter of what Aristotle says against Plato, but he must look towards the spirit and track down the harmony. So, Simplicius mentions some of the competences that we today would hope to find in a good interpreter of an ancient philosopher: full familiarity with the works of the ancient author and with the author's style of writing. But Simplicius also mentions the critical judgment which the teacher must exercise. He must not be sectarian, either in favor or in opposition to his author. This critical stance we have found already in Plotinus and in Proclus, as he was presented by Marinus. Simplicius mentions the intelligence which a teacher should have, looking to the spirit of his author's texts, not the letter. Simplicius referring to the intellectual excellence, the intellectual virtue which the teacher should have, a virtue also mentioned in similar descriptions of the qualities required of a good teacher given by the Alexandrian commentators. They also note the non-sectarian approach, the critical judgment which the good teacher should exercise, the need to refer to the canons of truth. The virtues which a good teacher, a good exegete, should display in interpreting an ancient author have as their opposite vices, which Simplicius finds in John Philoponus's interpretation of Aristotle. As Plotinus had attacked the Gnostics' reading of Plato by pointing to the moral and intellectual vices which characterized their approach to Plato, so Simplicius denounced these vices, which he found in the Christian Philoponus's reading of Aristotle. As regards the qualities which should characterize a good student, we might take an example of the following text from the Alexandrian commentator Olympiodorus. Can I have the next passage? Number 7. This is the second last passage on what should be the qualities of the student of Aristotle's writings. I say that he should be sensible, keen, made beautiful in his moral character, purified in his soul, constantly saying to himself Plato's words that if you do not hear it from yourself as you speak, do not believe anyone else who says it. And again, care little for Socrates, but care much for the truth. You have the references to Plato there. Indicating to us in all of this that we should honor truth above all things and make everything secondary to it. And indeed, the student should assimilate what is his to the universe, for as the universe has a king to whom are subordinated soldiers and serfs, so must also be the student of Aristotle's philosophy, having reason in the function of king, spirit in that of the soldiers, and desire in that of the servants. For reason should rule, spirit be ruled, and desire be ruled by both. But some people ask why, if soul has 3 parts, there are 4 virtues, wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. To those we can say that this is reasonable, since wisdom is a distinctive virtue of reason, courage of spirit, moderation of desire, and justice goes through all 3 parts of the soul and is seen in all. Olympiodorus mentions, therefore, as desirable in a good student both moral and intellectual qualities. Intellectual independence of judgment, care for the truth are first mentioned, but then Olympiodorus goes into some detail as regards moral virtue. This virtue is what Plotinus had called political virtue, consisting of the 4 cardinal virtues of Plato's Republic, which concern the rational ordering of irrational desires and emotions. The good student of Aristotle and a fortiori of Plato must have these virtues as well as higher intellectual virtue. For a description of this higher intellectual virtue, we might turn finally to another Alexandrian commentator known as David or as Elias. This is the last passage. If you can roll it down. I'm nearly finished. In this virtuous way should he live, the student of Aristotle's writings. But as for knowledge, let him be accurate, not depending on the plausibility of persons. For he will not randomly trust the ancients, but trusts in another way. For he trusts the Socrates who says, care little for Socrates, but care much for the truth, a quotation we have already met. And let the student be accurate for another reason, since the same experience produces contempt for reason and contempt for humanity. As Plato says in the Phaedo, from too easily putting trust in characters and discourses, we students should be accurate and not endure lengthy discourses, but give ourselves to discussion through question and answer. Since Socrates again says, If you do not hear it from yourself, as you speak, do not believe anyone else who says it. Again, a quote we've met. That is, if you have not granted the premises and have of necessity have conceded the conclusion, do not believe another. The beginning of this passage refers to a virtuous way of life. The commentator is thinking of the moral virtues which a good student should have. He then moves to intellectual virtue and again insists, as had Plotinus, Proclus, and Simplicius, on the necessity for critical thinking, on not being subordinate to the authority of others, on discovery for oneself of the truth. It is intriguing that the commentator recalls the Socratic horror of long speeches being inflicted on us, the Socratic call for discussions with questions and answers, in which the participant comes to knowledge from within. This Socratic framework for philosophizing may seem to us to be very far removed from the scholastic institutions of the Athenian and Alexandrian schools of late antiquity. But whatever the realities of school life, the commentator is presenting an ideal, a true philosophical Socratic way of reading the texts of ancient authors such as Aristotle and Plato. I'm coming up to my conclusion, which is just one page, and then I'm finished. Is this still okay? Yes?
Perfect,
okay.
Perfect. Very good, very good.
Okay, one page now. In conclusion, I think we can say that the ancient commentators had a very developed and systematic way of describing what it takes to be a good interpreter of Plato. They not only had an explanation of why we need to read Plato and why his texts require interpretation, they also set high moral and intellectual standards for us as readers of Plato, if we are to read his works correctly. We not only need to possess the moral virtues, a rational control of our desires and emotions, but we also need to have rational excellence. This involves knowledge of the text and of Plato's language, what we might call philological competence. But more remarkably, this rational excellence should also include non-sectarian critical judgment, an independence of thought whose sole criterion is the truth. In reading Plato, we activate our intelligence. In order to reach knowledge by and of. In other words, we ourselves need to become philosophers in reading Plato, if we are to read him correctly. We might say that in the case of the commentator's description of the good interpreter of Plato, we are dealing with an ideal of how things should be. What actually went on in the schools when Plato was read probably fell short of this ideal. Obviously, the ancient commentator's theory of what it is to interpret Plato involves presuppositions which we today hardly share. We do not think of ourselves as rational souls, at least I don't think we do, fallen through material seductions into confusion and ignorance, in need of recovering our lost knowledge by reading privileged sources of knowledge such as Plato's dialogues. As teachers, we can hardly think that we have saved ourselves and are trying to save our students. We would also probably feel that the interpretation and the interpreter should be separated. An interpretation can be good or bad, of whether or not the interpreter is a good or bad person. We might agree that some intellectual excellence is needed in order to read Plato adequately, even if we might feel that few of us measure up to Plato's own intelligence. But surely an interpretation of Plato may be good, even if the interpreter is driven by vanity, arrogance, desire for power, cupidity, moral dispositions which are likely to be considered in today's dominant ideology to be virtues, not vices. If we separate the interpretation from the depersonalizing the interpretation, imagining that it floats unattached, so to speak, in some virtuous space from which it can be downloaded by depersonalized readers, we might still ask, what criteria might now prevail in distinguishing good interpretations from bad ones? I have mentioned some of the current criteria at the beginning of my paper: peer review, institutional affiliation, written in English, citation indexes. These criteria are not beyond criticism. The peer review system can have the effect of reinforcing established conventions, conformism, making it difficult for heterodox and creative thinking to express itself. It also allows some editors of journals and publishers to surrender their primary responsibility and competence to the sometimes prejudiced judgments of referees. Institutional affiliation relates, in the Anglophone world, to an academic class system, Oxbridge and the Ivy League, housing a man as attendant kowtowers. The hegemony of English puts non-native speakers at a disadvantage, in particular in the humanities where language is so closely linked to culture and thinking. It satellitizes non-native speakers, so to speak, who, as scholars, feel they have to read Anglophone literature, even though its quality may be mediocre, while allowing native speakers to think that they need not read or understand anything that is not written in English. Citation indexes can have, which in the sciences may not be destructive or not as destructive as in the humanities. Emphasis may be placed on the quantitative rather than the qualitative, although to state the obvious, what is most cited is not necessarily the most important or the best. More generally, such criteria relate to the power structures and productivity standards of the modern academic industry. It might help us to reflect on them a little more critically if we contrast them with the very that the ancient commentators on Plato took to the question of how to read Plato well. There we are.
Thank you very much, Professor Mara. Thank you very much. I think it's a very insightful presentation. I think you touched in a very important topic about reading Plato and about the relationship we have to have in reading something. In reading something, I think that one question that one topic that perpasses what you thought what you talked right now is the status of reading and writing, and I found it very interesting of these last commentators, the imperative that you have to search in yourself, and even if what you're reading is correct, but if you don't find that in yourself, you don't have the criteria of that is very interesting because it gives an autonomy to the person that is searching. And it's very interesting, the definition of truth, right? Because the definition of truth is that you have found it inside of yourself, and that is it's not authority that really establishes the criteria of truth. Is not what is written, because what is written might because I'm remembering the seventh letter of Plato and the
Yes,
thesis
yes,
out of Plato, because of all the criticism he makes
yes,
on writing, and I think it's very close to all the it doesn't matter, and that's a very bright criticism on the philological criteria of interpreting, because it doesn't grasp the inner meaning, and I found it very interesting
yes,
that Proclus, I think it's Marinus, right? Has that, or other, I'm not remembering right now, the division between the letter and the spirit that we find
yes,
in Paul in the Bible, and that
yes,
is very strong in origin also, and the
yes,
keys, right? And I don't know. I would like to hear a little bit from you about the criticism on the status of writing and reading, and how we can read something to achieve, right, I don't know if you understand my question, but my topic
Yes.
is on the status of the validity of writing and reading.
Yes. Um, um, Let me say first of all that perhaps when we think about these people, Plotinus and the later people, Proclus and so on, and Simplicius, and we think of them as just interpreting Plato or Aristotle, perhaps the impression we might have is that they're completely subservient to their authorities. These are authority texts, okay? And they're like sort of holy, and they have to just follow these authorities. And when I was working on this paper, I discovered that actually that's not the case at all. That they have an amazing, at least theoretically, they have an amazing a need for independence, and the authorities' works are only authoritative to the extent that we see that it's in fact true what they're saying. But if we have doubts about what they're saying, or if we have reasons to doubt what they're saying, then we should not necessarily accept it. And this applies even to Plato. So I thought for me, this is a revelation that in fact there's this Socratic dimension to the interpretation of the text. But to come to your, I'm sorry, I'm a little blinded by the sun, which is hitting me straight in the face.
No, just thinking. Yeah, I can imagine. But thinking about what you just said nowadays,
yes, but if I can come back to your question a bit.
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, I was gonna comment only because nowadays, if you're only a commentator, you are not someone that has autonomy and thinking for yourself. But since to interpret Plato is to find the truth inside of yourself, so you have all autonomy, you have all independence that a philosopher must need to be a thinker on his own, even though he is also an interpreter.
Yes.
Please continue.
Yes. It's maybe the text is a kind of maybe the text is a stimulus or something that goads you on to something that wakes up something inside you. An occasion for philosopher. I thought this was an important point, that to read Plato properly, you have to philosophize yourself. And this position, which is, I think, there and very strong, means, of course, that a purely philological or historical interpretation of the text would not be considered by them as at all adequate. I want to, if I can come back to you're talking about reading.
Yes.
Yes. These are, I think, the texts did have a kind of authoritative status, and I don't know how to say it, almost a holy status. They were revealed to humanity. The Chaldean oracles, and even maybe Plato. But I think the very close human context of these schools, where they were very small, they were not like our universities. There were not that many people all knew each other, and they lived together and very closely. In fact, reading these texts was a kind of a communal endeavor and a lively endeavor, and probably involved a lot of discussion. So reading the text could be the occasion of what might even turn out to be Socratic discussions, as suggested in the last passage I read. So I think the texts don't have an absolute value, if you know what I mean. The written text doesn't have an absolute value, but it sort of gets on philosophy, and gives us all sorts of stimuli, gives us all sorts of ideas. But then But then what matters most is the inner life that we develop in working. Do you see what I mean? So I think it relativizes the status of the written text to some extent, this approach.
Perfect.
I don't know if I'm answering
it's
your
very
question.
interesting. Yes, yeah, no, perfect. I found it's very, very interesting to think that to read something is to live in a community also. You read together with other people and you philosophize together with these other people. And the sense and the profound meaning of the text comes up by talking about the text also, and in this talking and living in that community, the profound interpretation of the text shows up in it. So that is reading Plato. That is to be a commentator on Plato. Is to live a certain type of way, to live in a community that discuss these texts. That is very good.
Yeah, there are. Sorry, I have some.
Mhm.
I see some questions which I'll try to get to.
Yes.
But if I can just add a
Mhm.
few things, I think there are differences. For example, in Plotinus, Plotinus is. You know that his school was really pretty chaotic, and everybody talked except himself, and you just let them talk and talk and talk, and this was apparently very frustrating. So there wasn't
I
any
can imagine.
authority. There was no authority figure, and so there's extremely free discussion, and it could go in all directions. On the other hand, I get the impression in reading Marinus's Life of Proclus that Proclus was quite dictatorial in a way, and I'm not sure there was such a lively interchange in his school as there was in Plotinus' school. So maybe there were differences in the actual practice, but I think they all agreed that what this is all about is actually doing philosophy, and the texts give us the means of doing philosophy. They're not the end itself.
There is a question of Professor Cicero. Yeah, here. Thank you very
Yes.
much for the excellent conference. My question
You're,
is, what role among Plato's interpreters does the allegorical and mystagogical aspects of the dialogues play? He's thinking about Maximum of Tyrus, Proclus, and others who sees the necessity to understand the dramatic aspects and the scenic, the personae that are in the drama, right? We have sort of a play, a theater in the dialogue. So what do you think about these aspects, allegorical and scenic?
yes. Well, they're all very important. The text, these interpreters of Plato were much inspired by Plato's own requirements for good rhetoric and good logos, and including the idea that it's a whole. And what this means is that Plato's dialogues have to be considered as a whole. And so this means that everything in the dialogue, the theatrical aspects, as we might say, the characters, their behavior, all of this has significance. And then when Plato uses allegories or sort of mystagogical language, this is also not to be dismissed because it's not argument. Okay, it also has its deep meaning. But what controls your interpretation of all of these things, so they all have meaning, what controls your interpretation of these things is how they fit into a pattern of knowledge, if you see what I mean. So this gives you great freedom, for example, with respect to allegory. You can make the allegory say what you want, almost. Because it has to be signifying some truth, okay? And so this we might consider to be a problem because this is a sort of sort of a priori system almost that sort of determines how certain parts of Plato are read. But there is the requirement that it all means something, and that it should be signifying in some way some truth that it is our job to discover. I don't know if I'm answering Cicero's question adequately.
No, I think it's okay. We have another question here from Daisy Ellie that is making a doctorate in Plotinus and the reading of Plotinus of Plato. She would like to ask if you understand the position of Plotinus of reading a Platonic text as a virtuous disposition and not only as simple lecture, right? So, simple lecture. It can also be interpreted as an active, not only passive reception of Platonic doctrine that allowed the birth of Neoplatonism and Plotinus' henological system that exceeded the Platonic test and allowed the idea of a radicalization of transcendence. She sent me in private the rest of the it's right there. Yes, Cicero, it's he put it. And there's another. First, let's see what I think the main topic is this active reading, right? It's not only a passive reading.
Right. Yes. It may seem strange to us, like if you're giving a course on Plato and you require the students, if they're going to enter the course, to have certain virtues. Okay, you can you can
exactly.
just see how are they courageous, are they moderate.
Correct. It would be very strange to make as a prerequisite that to enter a course you have virtue. Yeah, but it's exactly it's that in ancient philosophy, right?
Yes.
That's
yes.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you're dissolute, for example, you'll be thrown out of the school. There are stories of this that the students get thrown out because they behave badly. Okay. But it's not because they break certain rules, like traffic rules, or they destroy shops or something like that. No, it's because they're manifesting moral vices. Okay, and so they get thrown out. And this for us is very peculiar. But I think what the idea behind that is that coming back to the idea of active reading, I think. When we read, it's as I was trying to say, it's not just transfer of information to an empty box. Like the student is an empty box, and you just put information in the box. As a teacher, it's not that at all. And the teacher is really the mediator between knowledge and the student. The teacher helps the student reach knowledge, but to do that, the student is actively involved. In other words, the student has to philosophize. But to philosophize means already, from the point of view of the student, a certain disposition, and this includes moral disposition. If you don't have the right moral disposition, you're not in a condition to listen to the text. To put it another way, you might say that you only hear what you're in a position, what you're disposed to hear. Or you could say you only see what you're disposed to see. And so in the same way, when you read, you only read what you're disposed to read. And so I think there's a certain profundity in this, that we have to have in ourselves the appropriate receptivity to be awake, to be aware, and to hear what the text is telling us. And if we don't have this receptivity, we'll be blind or deaf. I think if I can make a parallel, Plotinus has this idea is that to recognize beauty, we have to be ourselves beautiful. If we are not within ourselves beautiful, we won't see beauty. And so I think correspondingly, if we read texts and we don't have within ourselves, you might say an openness, a disposition to hear the truth, then we read the text, but we won't hear the truth that these texts give us. I don't know if you see what I mean. So, developing this argument, you could say that actually there is something to saying that reading involves qualities or dispositions in the reader. If the reader, especially for a very deep text like Plato, if the reader is to get anything from the text, if you don't have these dispositions, then probably a lot of it will go past you and you won't even notice. I'm not sure if I responded. It was a
Yes,
rather
very,
rich
very,
question.
very, yeah. I think it's perfect. I think that we have another question here. Thank you very much for the inspiring conference. I would like to ask a connected question about the role of Neoplatonic nous beyond reason or dianoia. I think it continues, right? It is connected to finding the spirit under, beyond the letter of the text as a kind of intuition or non-discursive thought. Reading Plato in a philosophical spirit, Proclus mentions illumination, inspiration, and a reading of Plato which follows the noetic. Is the nous what explains the topic of finding within ourselves the philosophical spark in the text, and that this is what awakens the nous in us as a form of inspiration?
Yes, I agree entirely. I think that's very good and it's important, and I'm sorry that I left it out. Maybe we could talk about the soul and what's in the soul and the soul's access to nous, to intellect. The fact that soul can react to a text and recognize knowledge in the text is of course possible because the soul already has this kind of innate knowledge. And I think this innate knowledge goes very deeply. It goes beyond discursivity to non-discursive, intuitive knowledge. And so to be inspired when you read an inspired text like Plato is to activate what in you is above discursivity and this intuitive intellect, and this so to speak is sparked by reading the text of Plato himself. So I agree entirely. I think that there's a kind of an intellectual discursive grasp of the text, but then there's even an insight beyond discursivity, which we have in us as a faculty of knowledge, and which is activated and which responds to the corresponding intuition or insight that is in Plato's text. I agree entirely with this idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting, because even in the level of nous, I'm not even speaking in the level of the one, right?
Yeah.
But in the level of nous, the type of knowledge is already beyond the discursivity of written language. At least there is some immediate intuition that plays that is different from an aspect of temporality. It's not a knowledge that you receive as the same timing as reading a text, right? But even in this moment, you have to go beyond the text anyway and find the truth inside of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry, I neglected all of these things, but they are very important. And you can go very far in this. You can say that in the end, everything is already in us, including the one. And so Proclus talks about the flower of intellect and these things. So the things we find in the text let's say, the metaphysical truths that we find in the text, they are already in us, right to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, in fact, what makes it possible for us to recognize and to find these things.
Great, great. What, Cicero is here? You want to say something? I think we are arriving at the end. And I don't know if we have some last questions. I think we have a very great, yeah, Sebastian that made this question is saying thank you very much. And I think we are over 1 hour here already, and I believe we have Cicero. Do you wanna say something? Do you wanna speak one or two things? Uh, just I don't know if he is appearing, but just thinking here together. Also, what is bringing back to me is that expression from Pierre Hadot, that philosophy is a way of living, is a matter of living, is a mode of living. Yeah? So if philosophy is a mode of living, reading philosophy is also a mode of is a
Yes,
type of a manner of living. So reading and interpreting a text, you have to embody the text in a way, right? You have to live. It's a lived text, right?
that's right.
It's something that you have to, and I believe that this is very important for our university nowadays, because in a way, probably because of the other types of discipline as physics and mathematics that has another type of knowledge. We in the humanities, we have to stress the importance of the way we live inside of the university, the way that I know that it's impossible to ask the person if he is virtuous or not, but to think about that, right? To think about this, a person may have a doctorate in ethics, but nobody asks him if he is a person that lives ethically, right? There is a total
Right,
total
right,
separation between the
right,
way we live and the titles we earn in the
right.
university. So
That's right.
probably we may at least think about it, how we could make it more, in the first place, our life in university something more pleasurable, something that makes us happy, right? And
Yeah,
also to how to dialogue with the concrete manner that people live in the
yeah,
world, and not make it totally separate, right? Because
exactly,
right, this is something to
exactly.
think about. I think it's a good contribution to our
Yeah,
days
yes,
manner of living also.
yes. You can see at the end I was pretty polemical, um,
Mhm,
because I think
mhm.
there's a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
wrong.
great, great.
There's a lot that's wrong
Yeah, right.
in what's going on today.
Mhm.
Okay.
Perfect. You list all the criterias, like citations on the index, right? To be in the university, and all of that may not be the ultimate criterion to know exactly what Plato is saying, right?
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Well, well, I
Okay.
believe I believe we are reaching the end. I thank you very much.
Okay.
It was very contemporary,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
your talk, and I'm sure we will we will get out from it. Take from it. Things are very very important for us here in Brazil and for our community over here. Thank
Thank
you
you very
very much.
much. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, okay. So
Okay.
see